My name is Glenn Harrison, 72 years old, and I never thought I would have to protect myself from my own flesh and blood. 3 days after burying Margaret, my wife of 47 years, my son Thomas informed me that our family business had been sold for a fraction of its worth. What he did not know was that I had anticipated his betrayal long before it happened. If you are watching this story unfold, let me know where you are from in the comments, and subscribe to hear how I turned the tables on my own son. The Harrison name used to mean something in this town. Not because we were the wealthiest or most powerful family, but because we built our reputation on honesty and quality work. Harrison Construction was my life's work, started from the back of a pickup truck with nothing but a toolbox and determination. Margaret, my wife, was there from day one. While I handled the building, she managed the books and kept us afloat during those lean early years. We grew that company from nothing to a $10 million business over 40 years. We specialized in custom luxury homes, the kind that families would pass down for generations. I took pride in every nail driven, every foundation poured. Each project carried my personal guarantee, and clients knew they could trust the Harrison name. Despite our success, Margaret and I lived modestly. We stayed in the same two-story colonial home we bought when Thomas was just a baby. We could have afforded something grander, but that house held our memories. The height marks on the kitchen doorframe tracking Thomas's growth. The oak tree in the backyard that I built a treehouse in when he was 8. The porch swing where Margaret and I would sit and watch the sunset after a long day of work. That house was worth more to me than any mansion we could have built. Thomas never understood our attachment to simple things. From an early age, he showed signs that worried me. When other kids wanted toys, Thomas wanted the most expensive brand. In high school, he measured friendships by what other kids' parents owned. Margaret and I tried to teach him the value of hard work, but something never quite connected. He just wants what all young people want, Margaret would say, to have it easier than we did. But I saw something different, something that made me uneasy. While Thomas learned the business, working summers and eventually joining full-time after college, he always seemed to be looking for shortcuts. He would charm clients with big promises, then cut corners on delivery. I would have to step in and make things right, which he resented. "Dad, we could triple our profits if you weren't so obsessed with doing everything the old-fashioned way," he would argue. When Thomas married Julia at 25, I hoped she might ground him. Instead, she fueled his ambitions. She came from a wealthy family that had lost everything in bad investments. Julia had tasted the high life and was determined to get it back through Thomas. They built a house they could barely afford, drove luxury cars, and took vacations to places Margaret and I had only seen in magazines. 2 years ago, Margaret was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months, but my Margaret was a fighter. She held on for 18. During those final months, as she grew weaker, she worried more about what would happen after she was gone than about her own suffering. "Glenn," she said to me one night, her voice barely above a whisper, "Thomas is going to try to take over everything once I'm gone. I've seen how he looks at the company, like it's already his. You need to protect yourself." I didn't want to believe it, but Margaret had always been a better judge of character than me. So together, during her final months, we met with our lawyer and restructured the business ownership. We created Sunrise Holdings, named for our habit of starting each workday watching the sunrise together. This holding company became the legal owner of Harrison Construction, with a complex ownership structure that few people knew about. The last weeks with Margaret were the hardest of my life. She was in constant pain, but still worried about me. The last coherent thing she said to me was, "Remember the sunrise, Glenn. Always remember our sunrise." 3 days later, she was gone. The funeral was a blur. Hundreds of people came to pay respects. Clients, employees, friends we'd made over decades. I barely registered their condolences. I just kept expecting to feel Margaret beside me, squeezing my hand the way she always did when I was overwhelmed. Thomas handled the arrangements efficiently, which I appreciated. But looking back, I realize he seemed more impatient than grieving. He kept checking his watch, rushing through conversations with long-time family friends. Julia spent most of the reception on her phone, stepping outside for calls. At the time, I attributed it to everyone processing grief differently. I was too lost in my own to notice what was really happening. Exactly 3 days after we laid Margaret to rest, Thomas and Julia arrived at my door unannounced. I was still in my robe at 10 in the morning, having barely slept since the funeral. The house felt too quiet without Margaret's presence. I had been sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her empty chair for hours. "Dad, you need to get dressed," Thomas said, walking in without waiting for an invitation. "Julia and I need to talk to you about something important." Julia followed behind him, her eyes sweeping critically over the unwashed dishes and mail piled on the counter. "This place is a mess, Glenn. You can't live like this." I shuffled to the bedroom and put on proper clothes, feeling like a stranger in my own home. When I returned, they were sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread out before them. "We've been thinking," Thomas began, his voice taking on that tone he used with difficult clients. "Too smooth, too practiced. This house is way too big for just one person. All these stairs, all this maintenance. It's not practical anymore. Your father deserves to relax now," Julia added, patting my hand in a way that felt condescending rather than comforting. "We found a really nice retirement community just outside of town. They have activities, medical staff on site, and you wouldn't have to worry about cooking or cleaning." I said nothing, just watched them exchange glances. There was something rehearsed about this whole conversation. "Anyway," Thomas continued, sliding some brochures toward me, "the good news is, you don't have to worry about the business anymore either. I've taken care of the transition." "Transition?" I asked, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. "The company, Dad. I know you and Mom never really planned for succession, but after she got sick, I realized I needed to step up and make some decisions." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a check, sliding it across the table to me. $5,000. The amount was so absurd I actually laughed, thinking it must be some kind of joke. "What's this for?" I asked. "Your share," Thomas said, as if it was the most reasonable thing in the world. "I found a buyer for Harrison Construction. They're going to take it in an exciting new direction." My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. "The company is worth at least $10 million, I said quietly. Thomas waved his hand dismissively. "On paper, maybe. But when you factor in outstanding liabilities, the outdated client acquisition methods, and the fact that the company's reputation was built around you and Mom, the buyer is actually doing us a favor taking it on." "Us?" I repeated. "Well, the family," Thomas clarified, not meeting my eyes. "Look, Dad, let's be honest. You're 72. The industry has changed. You were going to have to retire soon anyway, and without Mom handling the business side." He trailed off, implying I couldn't manage without her. Julia leaned forward. "This is good timing, Glenn. Now you can enjoy your retirement without worrying about work. Isn't that what Margaret would have wanted? For you to rest?" Using Margaret's name like that made my blood boil. But I kept my expression neutral. I'd learned long ago in business negotiations that the person who shows emotion first usually loses. "Who's the buyer?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Thomas smiled, clearly relieved I wasn't putting up a fight. "Albert Wright. Remember him? We were in college together. He's done really well for himself in real estate development." I remembered Albert Wright all too well. A loud, overconfident young man who had visited our home a few times during Thomas's college years. Margaret had taken an instant dislike to him, calling him a shortcut seeker after he bragged about cheating on exams. "And when did this sale happen?" I asked, gathering information while appearing confused. "We finalized it yesterday," Thomas said proudly. "Albert's already meeting with the project managers today to discuss the transition. He's going to keep most of the staff on, at least for now." "I see," I said, looking down at the insulting check. "And this is all legal? The sale?" Thomas and Julia exchanged another look, this one tinged with annoyance. "Of course it's legal, Dad. I wouldn't do anything illegal. I've been running most of the operations for the past year anyway, while you were taking care of Mom." The paperwork was straightforward. I nodded slowly, pretending to be a confused old man, coming to terms with a major change. I need some time to process this. It's all happening so fast. Julia stood up, clearly eager to leave. Of course, Glenn. Take all the time you need. We just wanted to give you the good news that you don't have to worry about anything anymore. She looked around the kitchen again. And seriously consider that retirement community. We can go tour it next week. As they prepared to leave, Thomas added casually, "Oh, and we should talk about the house soon, too. The market is hot right now, and you could get a good price. More than enough to cover the retirement community for years." They left me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a $5,000 check that was supposed to represent my life's work. As their car pulled out of the driveway, I finally allowed myself to feel the rage and betrayal that had been building throughout their visit. But beneath that anger was something else. A cold, clear sense of purpose. Margaret had been right, and thankfully, we had been prepared. The moment Thomas and Julia's car disappeared down the street, I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Diana Freeman's office, answered a familiar voice. "Diana, it's Glenn Harrison. I need to see you today. It's happening." 2 hours later, I was sitting in Diana Freeman's office. We'd met Diana 30 years ago when she was a young attorney just starting her practice. Margaret and I had given her our business when other construction companies considered her too inexperienced. Now she was one of the most respected corporate attorneys in the state, and more importantly, one of our most trusted friends. "So Thomas has made his move," Diana said, her expression grim as I recounted my morning visitors. "Sooner than we expected." "Margaret knew," I said, my voice catching. "She always saw him more clearly than I could." Diana nodded, pulling out a thick folder labeled Sunrise Holdings. "Well, the good news is that we're fully prepared. Thomas had absolutely no legal right to sell Harrison Construction. The company has been owned by Sunrise Holdings for the past 18 months, with you as the primary shareholder and decision-maker. Will that be enough to void the sale?" I asked. "More than enough," Diana assured me. "Thomas attempted to sell something he didn't own. That's not just invalid, it borders on fraud. The question now is how you want to handle this." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the situation. I need more information before I decide. I need to know exactly what Thomas has been doing and who else is involved. My next stop was to see Frank Cooper, the company's accountant for the past 2 decades. Frank had been reluctant to reach out to me directly after Margaret's death, not wanting to add to my grief, but I could see the relief in his eyes when I walked through his office door. "Glenn," he said, standing to greet me. "I've been worried. Thomas has been making some unusual moves with the company accounts." Frank showed me records of Thomas attempting to access accounts he shouldn't have known existed, accounts Margaret had set up as part of our contingency planning. There were also suspicious transfers between project budgets, and several large consulting fees paid to shell companies that Frank couldn't verify had done any actual work. "I tried to question these," Frank explained, "but Thomas said they were approved by you. When I asked for documentation, he threatened to replace me with someone more forward-thinking." The picture was becoming clearer and uglier. Thomas hadn't just betrayed me on impulse. He'd been planning this for months, possibly even before Margaret's condition worsened. My next stop was the office. I hadn't been there since Margaret entered hospice care, choosing to work remotely to spend more time with her. Walking through the doors of Harrison Construction felt strange now. Several employees looked surprised to see me, some even uncomfortable. Linda, our office manager for 15 years, pulled me aside immediately. "Mr. Harrison, thank goodness you're here. Things have been so strange lately." "Strange how?" I asked. "Thomas told everyone you wanted to step back completely after Mrs. Harrison passed, that you were selling the business to focus on your health." Linda looked around to make sure no one was listening. "But that didn't sound like you at all." It turned out Thomas had been systematically lying to our employees, clients, and vendors. He'd told the staff I was experiencing health problems of my own, possibly early dementia, and couldn't be bothered with business matters. He'd reassigned long-standing client relationships to himself, and a few new project managers he'd hired without proper vetting. Some of our most loyal employees had been marginalized or pushed into considering retirement. Linda had kept copies of concerning emails and memos, which she now handed to me in a thick envelope. "I knew something wasn't right," she said. "Mrs. Harrison always said to trust my instincts." My investigation continued for the rest of the day. I spoke with several project managers who shared their concerns about Thomas's new direction. He had promised contracts to friends without proper bidding, was considering cheaper materials that wouldn't meet our quality standards, and had even discussed firing older employees to bring in younger, hungrier talent at lower salaries. By the time I arranged a meeting with Albert Wright for the following day, I had a comprehensive picture of what Thomas had been planning. This wasn't just about taking over the company. It was about dismantling everything Margaret and I had built and extracting maximum profit without regard for quality, reputation, or the people who had helped build our success. Albert Wright agreed to meet me at a coffee shop downtown, looking nervous when he saw me. He was balder and heavier than I remembered from his college visits, with an expensive watch and suit that seemed to be straining at the seams. "Mr. Harrison," he said, offering his hand. "Thomas told me you were taking some time away from the business. I was surprised to get your call." "I bet you were," I replied, not taking his hand. "I'd like to discuss your purchase of my company." Albert shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I understand this might be emotional for you, but Thomas assured me that you were on board with the sale. He showed me documents with your signature. Did you have those signatures verified? Or the documents reviewed by your own legal team?" I asked, watching his expression carefully. "Well, Thomas and I go way back. I didn't think it was necessary to." He trailed off, the implications of what I was saying beginning to dawn on him. "Albert, I'm only going to say this once. Harrison Construction was not Thomas's to sell. He had no legal authority to transfer ownership. If you've transferred any funds or signed any documents, I suggest you speak with your attorney immediately because you're involved in a fraudulent transaction." The color drained from Albert's face. "That's not possible. Thomas showed me board minutes, ownership certificates." "Forgeries," I said simply, "and I have the original documents to prove it." Albert left our meeting looking shaken, immediately calling someone as he hurried to his car. I had planted the seed of doubt, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he discovered the truth for himself. My final task was to meet with Thomas's assistant, Jessica, who had reached out to Linda expressing concerns about some of Thomas's recent instructions. We met after hours at a small restaurant outside of town. "Mr. Harrison, I didn't know who else to talk to," Jessica said, her voice low despite the privacy of our booth. "Thomas has been having me prepare all these documents for various projects, but something doesn't seem right." Jessica had copies of emails, draft contracts, and even a preliminary plan to rename the company Wright Harrison Developments, removing most references to the original family business. There was also a list of employees marked for phase-out once the transition was complete, many of whom had been with us for decades. "He doesn't know I made these copies," Jessica said nervously. "But my dad always taught me that if someone asks you to do something that feels wrong, it probably is." I thanked her for her courage and assured her that her job was safe. By the end of the day, I had everything I needed to confront Thomas and reclaim what was rightfully mine. I returned home feeling exhausted but resolved, and slept soundly for the first time since Margaret's death. The weight of Thomas's betrayal hit me hardest in the quiet moments. I would wake up at 3 a.m, Margaret's side of the bed empty and cold, and the full reality of what was happening would crash over me like a wave. My son, my only child, had not only tried to steal my life's work, but had been planning it meticulously, waiting for his mother to die before making his move. The physical toll was undeniable. I lost 8 pounds in a week. My hands would shake sometimes when I thought about confronting him. My doctor friend James noticed immediately when we met for our weekly chess game. "Your blood pressure must be through the roof," he said, studying my face. "What's going on, Glenn?" I told him everything, the words pouring out like water through a broken dam. It felt good to confide in someone outside the situation, someone who had known both Thomas and me for decades. "I'm not surprised," James said finally, making his move on the chessboard. "Thomas has always wanted the rewards without the work." Margaret saw it clearly. "Where did we go wrong with him, James?" I asked, the question that had been haunting me for days. "What did we do that made him turn out this way?" James considered this thoughtfully. "Some people are just wired differently, Glenn. You and Margaret gave him every advantage, every opportunity to learn the right values. Some lessons just don't take." The betrayal cut deeper the next day when I discovered Thomas had been to the house while I was out. The spare key we kept hidden in the garage was on the kitchen counter, and Margaret's study door was ajar. Inside, her desk drawers stood open, and the collection of antique jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother was missing. I called Thomas immediately. "The jewelry," I said when he answered. "Where is it?" "Dad?" He sounded genuinely confused for a moment, then recovered. "Oh, Julia thought it would be better to keep Mom's valuables in our safe. The house is empty so much with you running around town lately. Those pieces were meant for Amelia when she turns 21, I said, referring to my granddaughter. Margaret was very clear about that. "And Amelia will get them," Thomas assured me smoothly. "Julia's just keeping them safe until then. You know how break-ins have increased in your neighborhood." I knew it was a lie. Julia had always coveted Margaret's jewelry collection, especially the Art Deco emerald necklace that had been passed down through generations. But arguing would only alert Thomas that I was onto him, so I let it go for now. The next betrayal came through a chance encounter at the supermarket. I ran into Elaine Parker, one of our oldest family friends. Her husband Bill and I had played football together in high school, and our families had shared holidays for decades. "Glenn!" she exclaimed, embracing me tightly. "How are you doing?" Thomas told us about the memory issues. "I'm so sorry." I pulled back, confused. "Memory issues?" Elaine looked uncomfortable. "He mentioned you've been having some cognitive difficulties since Margaret passed. That stress can do that, especially at our age." He seemed very concerned. Cold anger settled in my stomach as I realized Thomas was laying groundwork to question my mental competence. "Elaine," I said carefully, "I'm grieving, not declining. Thomas has been misrepresenting a few things lately." The conversation left me shaken. If Thomas was telling close friends I was experiencing cognitive decline, what was he telling others? My business associates? Our clients? The most painful revelation came during lunch with my grandchildren. Ethan, 19 and home from his first year at college, and 16-year-old Amelia met me at our usual Saturday spot, a diner Margaret and I had been taking them to since they were small enough to need booster seats. Amelia hugged me tightly. "Grandpa, Dad says you're selling the house. Is that true?" "What?" I looked between my grandchildren's concerned faces. "No, I have no plans to sell." Ethan frowned. "But Dad showed us the listing agreement. He said you signed it last week. He's been talking about turning your workshop into a game room after they renovate." My stomach dropped. Thomas wasn't just planning to move me out, he was already making promises about my home to his children. "And he said you're moving to Pine Valley Retirement Community," Amelia added. "We looked it up online. It seems nice, but it's so far away from us." I forced a smile, not wanting to burden them with the ugly truth about their father. "There's been a misunderstanding. I'm not selling the house or moving anywhere." The drive home from that lunch was when the memories hit hardest. I remembered Thomas as a toddler, his small hand in mine, as we walked around construction sites. Thomas at 8, proudly wearing a toy hard hat as he helped me build the treehouse. Thomas at his high school graduation, hugging Margaret and me, seemingly grateful for all we'd done. Where had that boy gone? Had he ever really existed? Or had I seen only what I wanted to see? At home, I found myself wandering into Thomas's old bedroom, preserved much as he'd left it when he went to college. Football trophies, model airplanes we'd built together, and photographs of happier times. I sat on the edge of his bed and allowed myself to cry for the first time since Margaret's funeral, not just for her loss, but for the son I thought I knew. Later that afternoon, my neighbor Sarah knocked on my door. Sarah and her husband had moved in next door 15 years ago, and she and Margaret had become close friends, sharing a passion for gardening and birdwatching. "Glenn, I hope I'm not overstepping," she began hesitantly. "But I thought you should know there was a real estate agent here yesterday, taking pictures of the exterior of your house. When I asked what they were doing, they said they were preparing a listing. Did Thomas let them in?" I asked. Sarah nodded. "He and Julia were giving them a tour. I assumed you knew. That evening, I drove to the cemetery where Margaret was buried. The granite headstone had just been installed the previous week, her name and the dates of her life etched in stone. Below was the quote we had chosen together: "Love builds a bridge that death cannot destroy." I sat beside her grave as the sun began to set, feeling her absence like a physical ache. "You were right about him, Margaret," I said softly. "You were always right. I should have listened sooner." The wind rustled through the nearby trees, and I could almost hear her practical, no-nonsense response. "So what are you going to do about it now, Glenn Harrison?" That night, I made one more discovery that solidified my resolve. While searching for a specific document in my home office, I found a draft contract Thomas had apparently printed at my house and forgotten to take with him. It detailed plans to sell my property to a development company for well below market value. The development company's principal investor? Albert Wright. The commission on the sale would go to Julia, who had recently obtained her real estate license. They weren't just trying to move me out of my home, they were planning to profit from it at my expense. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place, and with it, any lingering doubts about what I needed to do. I called Diana Freeman and told her to prepare all the necessary documentation. Then I called Thomas and invited him, Julia, and Albert Wright to dinner at my home. "I've been thinking about everything," I told him. "It's time we had a family meeting to discuss the future." Thomas sounded surprised, but pleased. "That's great, Dad. I think you're making the right decision." "Oh, I know I am," I replied, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. I spent all day preparing for the dinner. Not the food, which was catered from Margaret's favorite Italian restaurant, but the atmosphere. I wanted everything to seem as if I had accepted my fate. I put out photo albums on the coffee table, hung the retirement community brochure on the refrigerator with a magnet, and even packed a few boxes that I left visible in the hallway. Thomas, Julia, and Albert arrived together at 7, all dressed as if for a business meeting rather than a family dinner. Thomas carried a bottle of expensive champagne. "To celebrate new beginnings," he announced, handing it to me with a practiced smile. "Indeed," I agreed, ushering them into the dining room, where the table was set with Margaret's best china. Julia looked around approvingly. "The place looks better, Glenn. Have you started sorting through things for the move?" I nodded vaguely. Just beginning the process. Hard to know where to start after 47 years. Albert seemed uncomfortable, avoiding direct eye contact with me. The meeting with him had clearly raised some doubts, but not enough to keep him from coming tonight. Greed was a powerful motivator. I served the food and poured wine for everyone except myself, claiming my medication didn't mix well with alcohol. I wanted a clear head for what was coming. The conversation throughout the appetizer and main course was strained, with Thomas dominating as usual, talking about his grand plans. "Albert's vision for Harrison Construction is really exciting, Dad," Thomas enthused. "Tell him about the Riverside development, Al." Albert launched into a description of a massive luxury condo project he wanted to build on riverfront property. The city had been trying to develop for years. The permits have been the main obstacle, but with Harrison's reputation and my connections, we should be able to fast-track approval. I nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like an ambitious project. How will you handle the environmental concerns? That land has significant wetland areas." Albert waved dismissively. "There are always ways around those regulations if you know the right people." I caught Julia's warning glance at him but pretended not to notice. "And what about our current projects? The Wilkerson house is only half finished, and the Donovan commercial building has strict quality specifications." Thomas jumped in. "We'll honor existing contracts, of course, but moving forward, we're thinking of targeting a different client base. Less custom work, more volume." Less attention to detail. More profit margin, I translated. Business evolution, Dad, Thomas corrected. The market has changed. And the employees? I asked. Many of them have been with us for decades. We'll keep the essential ones, Albert assured me, cutting into his steak. But honestly, some of your crew are getting up there in years. New blood might be good for innovation. I noticed he'd already shifted to talking about your crew rather than our team, as we'd always referred to our employees. The distance was telling. As dinner progressed, I continued asking innocent questions, letting them reveal more of their plans. They grew more comfortable as I appeared to accept everything without objection, even nodding along at times. You know, Julia said as she finished her second glass of wine, we should talk about the house too. I have a client who would love this location. We could probably close within 30 days. 30 days, I repeated. That's fast. Where would I go in the meantime? The retirement community has immediate openings, Thomas said quickly. We could move you in next week if needed. The casual way they discussed dismantling my life, as if I were a piece of furniture to be relocated, strengthened my resolve for what came next. As we finished the main course, I stood up. Before dessert, I'd like to propose a toast. I raised my water glass, to new beginnings, as Thomas said, and to clarity. They raised their glasses, looking pleased but slightly confused by my sudden cooperation. I've been doing a lot of thinking since our talk, Thomas. About legacy, about what Margaret and I built together, and about what happens next. I looked directly at Albert. I have just one question before we proceed. Albert, exactly who did you buy Harrison Construction from? Albert glanced at Thomas before answering. Well, from Thomas, acting as your representative. All the paperwork was in order. Acting as my representative, I repeated slowly. And you verified his authority to sell? Albert shifted uncomfortably. As I mentioned before, Thomas and I have known each other for years. He assured me that you had authorized the sale. I nodded and walked to the sideboard where I'd placed a folder earlier. Thomas, do you remember when Mom and I created Sunrise Holdings? About 18 months ago, when her treatment options were running out? Thomas's expression faltered slightly. Vaguely. Some kind of estate planning thing, right? Much more than that. I opened the folder and placed several documents on the table. Sunrise Holdings is the legal owner of Harrison Construction. Has been for over a year. All the shares were transferred out of our personal ownership and into the holding company. Thomas's face drained of color. That's not possible. I've seen the company filings. You saw what we wanted you to see, I replied, sliding the certificate of ownership across the table. Margaret and I set this up specifically because she was concerned about what would happen after she was gone. Albert was already scanning the documents, his expression growing increasingly alarmed. Thomas, what the hell is this? You told me you had full authority to sell. I do, Thomas insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Dad must have forgotten about the restructuring. His memory has been spotty lately. My memory is fine, I said firmly. And these documents, filed with the state and witnessed by 2 attorneys, say that you had absolutely no authority to sell Harrison Construction to anyone. The company you sold to Albert never belonged to you. Albert stood up abruptly. I need to make a call. This is potentially fraud, Thomas. Wait, Thomas pleaded. There's been a misunderstanding. Dad and I can sort this out. But Albert was already stepping into the hallway, phone in hand. Julia turned on Thomas, her voice a harsh whisper. You said this was all taken care of. You said your name was on the ownership documents. It was, Thomas insisted, looking desperately through the papers I'd provided. Dad, this isn't right. You're confused about the timeline. I sat back in my chair, feeling strangely calm now that the moment had arrived. I'm not confused about anything, Thomas. You tried to sell something that wasn't yours to sell. You tried to take what Margaret and I spent 40 years building and cash it in for quick profit. That's not fair, Thomas protested. I've worked for the company too. I deserved more say in its future. You had a job, Thomas. Not ownership. There's a difference. I looked at him steadily. You were paid well for your work, given opportunities many would envy. But that didn't give you the right to steal the company, Albert returned, his expression grim. My lawyer confirms it. The sale is invalid. I need all the money I transferred returned immediately, Thomas. All of it. Thomas looked panicked. I've already invested some of it. I can't just return it all at once. That's your problem, Albert snapped. I'm not going to be dragged into a legal nightmare because you lied to me. He turned to me. Mr. Harrison, I apologize for my part in this. I should have done more due diligence. Yes, you should have, I agreed, especially given your plans for the company once you acquired it. Quality matters, Mr. Wright. It always has at Harrison Construction. Albert collected his coat and left without another word, the front door slamming behind him. In the ringing silence that followed, I turned back to Thomas and Julia. Now, about that champagne. I don't think we'll be needing it tonight. The silence after Albert's departure stretched uncomfortably until Thomas finally broke it. His voice caught between anger and desperation. Dad, you've completely overreacted, he said, attempting to regain control of the situation. I was trying to secure our family's future. The industry is changing, and we needed to adapt. Our family's future? I repeated. Or your future, Thomas? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you were willing to sacrifice everything your mother and I built so you could cash out quickly. That's not fair, Thomas protested. I've dedicated my life to Harrison Construction too. Have you? I pulled out another folder, this one containing the documents Frank had provided. Because according to our company records, you've taken out 3 unauthorized loans from company accounts in the past 2 years, totaling over $200,000. Loans that were never approved by the board and never repaid. Julia's head snapped toward Thomas. You told me those were bonuses. They were advances, Thomas said defensively. I was going to pay them back from the sale proceeds. And what about the consulting fees paid to Skyline Management Group? I continued. A company that, coincidentally, was registered to your college roommate Patrick and seems to have provided no actual services to Harrison Construction. Thomas's face reddened. Those were legitimate business expenses for market research and client development. $250,000 for reports no one has ever seen? I shook my head. Margaret tracked every penny that went through that company. Did you think no one would notice once she was gone? Julia stood up, her composure cracking. I need to understand what's happening here. Thomas, have you put us at legal risk? Because if Albert pursues fraud charges, he won't, Thomas insisted. It was a misunderstanding, not fraud. Selling something you don't own is the definition of fraud, Thomas, I said quietly. And if I choose to pursue it, there's enough evidence here for criminal charges, not just civil action. The color drained from Julia's face. Criminal charges? Thomas, you said this was all above board. It would have been fine if Dad had just gone along with it. Thomas snapped, his true colors finally showing. The company is practically mine anyway. I've been running it for the past year while he played nurse to Mom. His words hung in the air like poison. Played nurse? I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. Is that what you call staying by the side of my wife of 47 years while she died of cancer? Thomas realized his mistake too late. I didn't mean it like that. I think you did, I said. And that's the difference between us, Thomas. When Margaret needed me, there was no place else in the world I would have been. The company could have burned to the ground for all I cared, because I understood what really mattered. Julia gathered her purse. I need some air. This is not what you told me was happening, Thomas. She headed for the door, pausing only briefly. Glenn, for what it's worth, I didn't know about the fraud part. Thomas told me you had agreed to sell and were just being difficult about the details. After she left, Thomas's demeanor changed entirely. The mask of the concerned son fell away, replaced by cold calculation. So what now? He asked. You expose everything and tear apart the family? What good does that do anyone? That depends entirely on you, I replied. I have no desire to see my only child face legal consequences. but I won't allow you to take what isn't yours either." "What do you want?" Thomas asked, his tone making it clear he was now treating this as a negotiation. "First, your resignation from Harrison Construction, effective immediately. You'll receive 2 months severance, which is more than generous given the circumstances." "You're firing me?" Thomas looked genuinely shocked, as if this possibility had never occurred to him. "You can't run the company without me. Most of the client relationships are mine now." "I built those client relationships before you were born," I reminded him, "and the company existed long before you joined it. We'll manage." Thomas's shock gave way to anger. "Fine. Fire me. I'll start my own competing firm and take half your clients with me." "You're welcome to try," I said calmly. "But your non-compete agreement is quite comprehensive. Diana updated it last year when you took on more responsibility, if you recall. You won't be working in custom home construction in this state for at least 2 years." Thomas paled. He clearly hadn't considered this obstacle. 2 years? How am I supposed to support my family? "You have an MBA from a good university. I'm sure you'll find something." I continued with my terms. "Second, Margaret's jewelry is to be returned, all of it, by noon tomorrow. Those pieces were meant for Amelia, not for Julia to wear or sell." Thomas nodded reluctantly. "Julia won't be happy, but fine. Third, you will correct the narrative you've been spreading about my mental decline. You will tell our friends, our employees, and our business associates that you misspoke, that I am perfectly competent. And if I refuse?" Thomas challenged. "Then I will have no choice but to involve the authorities regarding the financial irregularities I've discovered. Fraud, embezzlement, forgery of company documents. The list is quite extensive, Thomas." He stared at me for a long moment, calculation visible in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. "I'll do what you ask. But this changes everything between us. You understand that, right? You changed everything the moment you decided to steal from me and erase your mother's legacy," I replied. "I'm just responding to your choices." After Thomas left, I sat alone at the dining table, surrounded by the remnants of our uncomfortable dinner. The house felt emptier than before, if that was possible. I had won, but the victory was hollow. My son had revealed himself to be someone I didn't know and couldn't trust. The family Margaret and I had cherished was fractured, perhaps beyond repair. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting of all Harrison Construction employees. Standing before them in our main conference room, I explained that Thomas would no longer be with the company and that I would be resuming full leadership responsibilities. "But weren't you selling the company?" one project manager asked, confusion evident. "That was a misunderstanding," I said diplomatically. "Harrison Construction remains in the family, as Margaret and I always intended." There were questions, of course, and concerned looks. Change always brings uncertainty. But as I walked around the office later that day, I was approached by many longtime employees expressing relief and support. "We were worried about what would happen to the company's values under new ownership," Linda confided. "Your and Mrs. Harrison's approach to business is what made many of us stay all these years." The following weeks were challenging as I reorganized the company leadership structure. I promoted several deserving employees to fill the gap left by Thomas's departure, and hired a promising young architect who shared our vision for quality and integrity. The hardest part was facing extended family and friends. Word spread quickly about Thomas's departure from the company, and people naturally had questions. I kept the explanations simple and avoided details that would further damage Thomas's reputation. "We had different visions for the company's future," became my standard response. Some family members took sides. Margaret's sister Caroline called me in tears, saying Thomas had told her I forced him out in a power play. Others expressed support, saying they had always sensed Thomas's ambition outweighed his principles. The most painful consequence was the distance that developed between me and my grandchildren. Thomas and Julia limited their visits, using various excuses. Ethan and Amelia, confused by the sudden family tension, became awkward around me. Our once easy relationship felt strained, filled with unasked questions. I tried to maintain connection, attending Amelia's school play and Ethan's college parents' weekend. But Thomas was always there, creating a palpable tension. After one particularly uncomfortable dinner where Thomas barely spoke to me, Ethan walked me to my car. "Grandpa, what really happened between you and Dad?" he asked. "He won't tell us anything specific, just that you didn't trust him to run the company." I placed a hand on his shoulder, choosing my words carefully. Sometimes people have very different ideas about the right way to do things. Your father and I discovered our values aren't as aligned as I thought. But Ethan, none of this changes how I feel about you or your sister. You two are the most important people in my life. Ethan nodded, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. How could I explain that his father had tried to steal my company, my home, and even my dignity without destroying Ethan's relationship with him? Some truths were too heavy to place on a 19-year-old's shoulders. 6 weeks after our confrontation dinner, Thomas requested a meeting. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. He looked tired, the confident swagger diminished. "I've been offered a position with a development firm in Chicago," he said without preamble. "Julia and I are considering it." "Chicago is a long way from here," I observed, thinking of my grandchildren. "That's part of the appeal," Thomas admitted. "A fresh start." He stirred his coffee unnecessarily. "The thing is, this job pays significantly less than I was making at Harrison. We would need to sell our house, and with the mortgage we have..." I waited, already suspecting what was coming. "I'm asking if you would consider a more generous separation package," Thomas finally said. "For the grandchildren's sake, if nothing else. Amelia's college fund isn't fully funded yet." I studied my son's face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding. I saw only calculation. "I already have a plan for Ethan and Amelia's education," I told him. "It's been in place since they were born. Their college expenses will be covered regardless of your financial situation." "And what about us?" Thomas asked. "After everything, you're just going to let your son and his family struggle? You made choices, Thomas. Choices that hurt me deeply, that would have hurt your mother deeply. Those choices have consequences." I leaned forward. "You're not entitled to profit from attempted theft." Thomas's expression hardened. "So that's it? 48 years as your son? And this is what it comes down to?" "I could ask you the same question," I replied quietly. 40 years building a business based on integrity, and you were willing to throw it all away for a quick payday." We parted without resolution, the distance between us wider than ever. A week later, Thomas accepted the Chicago job, and within a month, they had moved. My grandchildren called occasionally, their voices subdued and conversation guarded. Each call ended with promises to visit soon, but those visits didn't materialize. The company continued to thrive under my renewed leadership. I implemented changes Margaret and I had discussed before her illness, modernizing certain aspects while maintaining the core values that had built our reputation. I worked longer hours than I had in years, finding purpose in preserving what we had created together. But nights and weekends were difficult. The house felt too large, too empty. I would catch myself turning to share a thought with Margaret, only to be met with silence. And despite everything, I missed my son, or at least the son I thought I had. 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything, I stood in the backyard of our family home, watching the sunrise just as Margaret and I had done countless times before. The golden light spilled across the garden she had lovingly tended for decades, now maintained by a local landscaper who followed her detailed plans. "You were right about everything, Margaret," I said aloud. A habit I developed in the months since her passing. About Thomas, about protecting the company. I just wish you were here to help me figure out what comes next. What came next began to take shape that very morning. I called Diana Freeman with an idea that had been forming for weeks. "I want to create a scholarship foundation in Margaret's name," I explained, "for young people interested in construction trades or architecture, especially those who might not otherwise have the opportunity for higher education." "Margaret would love that," Diana agreed. "And it's a tax-advantageous way to ensure your legacy continues beyond the business itself." With Diana's help, The Margaret Harrison Foundation for Building Futures was established within a month. We set aside a significant initial endowment, with plans to fund several full scholarships each year. The application process would emphasize not just academic achievement, but character, work ethic, and community involvement, the qualities Margaret had valued most. The foundation gave me a new purpose beyond the day-to-day operations of Harrison Construction. I began visiting local high schools and community colleges, speaking about careers in construction and the importance of integrity in business. Many students were surprised to learn that skilled trades could lead to fulfilling, well-paying careers without the burden of massive student loans. At one such presentation at the community college, I noticed a familiar face in the back row. Ethan, my grandson, had driven 6 hours from Chicago without telling anyone. After my talk, he approached somewhat hesitantly. "That was really good, Grandpa," he said. "I never knew all the details about how you and Grandma built the business." We went for coffee afterward, the first time we'd been alone together since the family split. Ethan seemed older somehow, more serious than the carefree college student I remembered. "Dad doesn't talk about Harrison Construction anymore," he told me. "And when I ask about you, he changes the subject." "Your father and I have very different perspectives on what happened," I said carefully. Ethan nodded. "I figured that out. And I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do after graduation next year." He hesitated before continuing. "I was wondering if I could intern at Harrison Construction this summer. Learn the business from the ground up, the way you did." The request caught me by surprise. "What does your father think about that?" "I haven't told him yet," Ethan admitted. "But I'm 20 years old, Grandpa. I need to make my own decisions about my future." That summer, Ethan moved into my guest room and began working at Harrison Construction, starting in the estimating department and rotating through various aspects of the business. He had his grandfather's work ethic and his grandmother's eye for detail, qualities that made me prouder than I could express. "You don't need to choose between your father and me," I told him one evening as we grilled steaks on the patio. "Family relationships are complicated, and adults can disagree without forcing others to take sides." Ethan considered this as he flipped a steak. "Dad made his choices, and now I'm making mine. I want to learn from someone who built something lasting, not someone who tried to cash in quick." His words stung despite their validation of my principles. Thomas was still my son, despite everything, and hearing his own child's disappointment was painful. The mentorship program that began with Ethan soon expanded. I established a formal internship program at Harrison Construction, specifically targeting young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Several of Margaret's former teachers connected me with promising students who needed not just employment, but guidance. "Mrs. Harrison always believed in me when no one else did," explained Jamal, a brilliant young man from the community center where Margaret had volunteered. "I want to make her proud." Working with these young people energized me in ways I hadn't expected. Their fresh perspectives challenged me to reconsider some of my more traditional approaches, while my experience gave them a foundation of practical knowledge no classroom could provide. With Diana's help, I also developed a comprehensive succession plan for Harrison Construction. Rather than seeking another buyer, I established an employee ownership structure that would gradually transfer control of the company to those who had helped build it and maintained its values. This way, I explained to the management team, Harrison Construction can continue long after I'm gone, still guided by the principles Margaret and I established. 9 months after our confrontation dinner, I received an unexpected call from Thomas. His voice sounded strained, lacking the confidence I was accustomed to hearing. "Dad, I think we need to talk," he said. "Things in Chicago aren't working out as planned. The development firm is cutting staff, and I'm on the list." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, meaning it despite everything. "Julia and I have been talking," he continued. "We're considering moving back. Not immediately, but eventually." He paused. "I know I have no right to ask, but is there any possibility of returning to Harrison Construction, even in a reduced capacity?" The old Thomas would never have suggested a reduced capacity. His humility seemed born of necessity rather than genuine change, and I felt a familiar wariness. Thomas, I don't think that would be best for either of us, I said gently. Too much has happened. But I'm willing to provide references for other positions, if that would help. His disappointment was palpable through the phone. I understand. It was worth asking. Another pause. Ethan tells me he's working for you this summer. He's doing very well, I confirmed. He has real talent for this business. At least one Harrison man will follow in your footsteps, Thomas said, an edge creeping into his voice. After we hung up, I sat in my office looking at the family photographs on my desk. Thomas as a baby in Margaret's arms. Thomas on his first bicycle. Thomas in his cap and gown at graduation. So many moments when the future seemed full of promise, unmarred by the choices that would eventually divide us. I didn't hate my son. Despite everything he'd done, I couldn't erase 4 decades of love. But I couldn't trust him either, and without trust, our relationship would always be limited. It was a painful reality I was still learning to accept. A week later, I received a text from Amelia, asking if she could visit for a weekend. She arrived on a Friday afternoon, her 16-year-old energy filling the too-quiet house with life again. We baked Margaret's famous chocolate chip cookies using the recipe card written in her neat handwriting, and Amelia told me about her life in Chicago, carefully avoiding mention of the tension between her father and me. On Saturday morning, I found her in Margaret's garden, sitting on the stone bench beneath the flowering dogwood. I miss Grandma, she said simply as I joined her. Dad never talks about her anymore. It's like he wants us to forget. People grieve differently, I said, putting an arm around her shoulders. Some find comfort in memories, others in moving forward. But it's like he's trying to erase everything from before, Amelia continued. He got rid of all the photos of you in our new house. When I asked why, he said it was complicated adult stuff I wouldn't understand. I took a deep breath. Your father and I had a serious disagreement about the family business. We both made choices that have made it difficult to repair our relationship. But Amelia, none of that changes how much I love you and Ethan. She leaned against me. I know, Grandpa. And I think Dad does love you too. He's just too stubborn to admit he made a mistake. Maybe someday, I acknowledged, though I wasn't convinced. In the meantime, you're welcome here anytime. This will always be your home too. By the 1-year anniversary of Margaret's death, Harrison Construction was thriving under the new employee-centered model. I had scaled back my hours somewhat, delegating more responsibility to the capable team we'd assembled. The Margaret Harrison Foundation had awarded its first round of scholarships to 5 promising students, and the mentorship program had expanded to include partnership with the local trade school. On the anniversary itself, I hosted a small gathering at our home, close friends, loyal employees, and my grandchildren who had driven in from Chicago. We shared memories of Margaret, laughing and crying in equal measure as we recalled her intelligence, her compassion, and her occasional stubbornness. To Margaret, I toasted, raising my glass as the sun set over the garden she had loved, who taught us all that what matters most in life isn't what you acquire, but what you build that lasts. The gathering included a surprise guest. Thomas had driven my grandchildren down but initially planned to stay at a hotel rather than join the memorial. At the last minute, Ethan had convinced him to at least make an appearance. Our interaction was awkward but civil. Thomas seemed thinner, the strain of the past year evident in new lines around his eyes. We spoke briefly about neutral topics, the weather, the children's school achievements, before he made an excuse to leave early. As he was preparing to go, he paused by the front door. The Scholarship Foundation is a good idea, he said stiffly. Mom would have approved. It wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but it was something, a small recognition of Margaret's values that had guided my decisions. Thank you, I replied. She always believed in giving people opportunities to build their own futures. Thomas nodded once before leaving. I didn't know if this small moment of connection would lead to anything more substantial, but it felt like a tiny crack in the wall between us, a possibility where before there had been none. In the months that followed, I found a new balance in my life. Harrison Construction remained important, but it no longer consumed all my energy. I joined a local community theater group, something Margaret had always encouraged me to do. I took fishing trips with old friends. I even began dating occasionally, after initial reluctance and guilt, knowing Margaret would have wanted me to find companionship. Ethan decided to join Harrison Construction full-time after graduation, bringing fresh ideas and technological knowledge that complemented my experience. We established a 3-year training program that would expose him to every aspect of the business before he took on any management role. "I want to earn it, Grandpa," he insisted. "No shortcuts." The irony wasn't lost on me that my grandson understood what my son never had. True success comes from building something of value, not from taking what others have built. Life continues to present challenges and opportunities. Some days the absence of Margaret feels as fresh as the day she died, while other days I can feel her presence in the business we built, the garden she planted, and the values now being embraced by a new generation. The company that Thomas tried to sell for a fraction of its worth now serves as a model for ethical business practices in our industry. The home he tried to take from me has become a gathering place for young people learning the trade, for community events, and for family healing. What I've learned through all of this is that wealth isn't measured in dollars or property. True wealth comes from integrity, from relationships built on trust rather than transaction, and from creating opportunities that outlive you. Margaret understood this instinctively. I learned it through painful experience. And perhaps someday, Thomas will come to understand it too. Until then, I focus on what I can build rather than what I've lost. Each sunrise reminds me of Margaret's final words. "Remember the sunrise, Glenn. Always remember our sunrise. Not an ending, but a beginning. A promise that even after the darkest night, light returns, bringing new possibilities." Have you ever had to protect what you've worked your whole life to build? Do you believe family relationships can heal after such deep betrayals? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories about overcoming life's most challenging moments. Thank you for listening. And remember that sometimes our greatest strength comes when we're tested by those closest to us.